everyone. This is Marila from Marcus Evans. Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Omnichannel Simplified, Practical Steps to Build Momentum, brought to you in partnership with Merge. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. As you can see, at the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets that you can use. All the widgets are resizable and movable, so please feel free to move them around. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit it in the Q&A widget. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible. However, if we run out of time, we'll make sure to answer to you by email. Also, you can access several interesting links and PDFs by clicking the resource list. You can bookmark them or download them. Also, after 2 hours, when the webinar is done, you can also watch it on demand. At this point, I will also want to inform you that we will proceed with a 1-hour webinar. We can also proceed with answer the question, or you can also share it to your email to watch it on the on-demand. At this point, I will briefly introduce our moderator today, Pat McLoin, Managing Director and Head of Life Science at Merge. Pat, you can take the stand.
All right, thank you, Marilia, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Looking forward to having another productive conversation about how to gain momentum when you're trying to implement an omnichannel strategy. And today's focus is really around how we can be more practical in that process. And so as we dig into it, I'd like to first introduce our guest today. Jason, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Budelman, SVP of Analytics here at Merge, where my team oversees really everything from audience segmentation to the MarTech implementation of Omnichannel to make sure that we are getting to those optimized best practical steps to drive momentum for your organization.
And then Luke, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, you bet, Pat and Jason, and to our whole audience today, very much appreciate the opportunity to join Merge on the call today. Rather than telling you what I do today, I'm going to tell you what I've done. I've been in the industry for 25 years, and you may look at me and say, "Nah, I don't believe that. You're too young." But for those of you that know me, my youthful exuberance exceeds what I've actually done. So I've been in the industry 25 years. I spent a third of that in sales, just carrying a bag in and out of doctors' offices, firsthand knowledge of the most important space in the industry, the 3 feet between the rep and the doctor. Spent a decade in marketing, launched some good products, launched some products not so well that maybe went kind of sideways. I learned a lot of tough lessons from. And then the last decade, I've been here at IQVIA leading our market access center of excellence, where we do all kinds of stuff about bringing a product to market and work with hundreds of clients across the industry. So happy to be here and participating today.
Awesome. Well, let's get into it. And with that background, Luke, I think this is a great opportunity to start with you with the first question, which is, why do so many organizations feel like omnichannel is difficult to achieve? What do you think are some of the greatest misconceptions about, implementing and taking on an omnichannel strategy?
I think anytime that you're taking on a strategy of the level of sophistication that omnichannel can potentially be, I think it starts with knowing what you're actually trying to accomplish and are you measuring the right things, right? So to say, am I effective or am I not effective? Well, if you're not actually looking at the right signals in the data, or you're not at the right level of granularity with what your campaign maybe you're too deep, right? That goes both directions. It's not necessarily being too shallow, not necessarily being overly deep, because that can confuse what you're trying to measure. As you kind of back that out and you try to balance that out, am I looking at the right thing? Right? As simple as what that can sound like, it can be really complex as you're trying to put it together. And that makes it really difficult sometimes to know, is it a good campaign or not a good campaign?
That's a great response and a great lead into the next question, really thinking about how you make sure you're speaking to the right audiences in the right way. I know we talk a lot about the importance of segmentation. And Jason, maybe you can answer this one. For someone starting out, how should they approach segmentation to really align on their priorities? And maybe what's the first or most simple way to get started from a segmentation perspective?
Yeah, I think that it's certainly in terms of building momentum, and this is where like Luke and I agree a great amount. Segmentation is really that valuable lever that when you get into market with the campaign or whatever promotional efforts you're putting out there, segmentation is really what allows you to break the signals from the noise and understanding how people are responding to the marketing efforts that you're putting out there. So pragmatically, if you have an audience or entire population, just breaking that into pieces, by definition, is a segmentation. Obviously, what we like to do in the best case scenarios is marry that segmentation or how we're breaking down that audience into pragmatic pieces of how we're touching the audiences or how we think they might adopt, and really bringing in some of the reasoning of things that we may want to optimize on or understand better as we go through the campaign. I think the important part of omnichannel is that you're getting smarter and you're getting more efficient as you go along. So obviously that helps what drives the momentum. So in short, understanding the segmentation is kind of building the foundation for the levers that you want to pull for how you're going to build your understanding to get smarter as you go through it.
Excellent. And Luke, what do you feel are the foundational elements that are kind of the non-negotiables that pharma companies should be thinking about if they're looking to succeed in their omnichannel efforts?
Yeah. As I started out, I've been in the industry for 25 years. And I would say one of the most common mistakes that I see made broadly in the industry, right? And many stakeholders make this piece. We measure the same things today, by far and large, that we measured 20 years ago, right? So if our analytics have not advanced and we're still using some of this, brute force segmentation, just looking at volumetric trends, we're missing out on a tremendous amount of behavioral pieces that we can learn that actually drives behavior. Let's say you're doing just traditional segmentation. You deciled your doctors. You got 1,000 doctors. You got 100 doctors in each decile. Decile 10 being the most volumetric ones, the ones that have the highest volume. Does that mean they're first to write? No, far from it. Right? We need to understand what are the patient flows that are moving in and out of their practices. What are the diagnoses that those patients have? What are the combinations of those? Right? Where do the patients flow through? What's their referral patterns look like? Are there behavioral dynamics about the payer profile that may sit in that provider's office that are going to influence what their decision making is? Do they have more Medicare or commercial? Right? All of those pieces are segments that we can think about as you're trying to structure what's going to be the best audience for a particular message, right? And then you test and control some of that. Beyond that, so that's just on the front end of it. On the back end of it, if we're only measuring filled prescriptions, we're missing out on a tremendous amount of activity. Jason and I were talking at a conference a couple of months ago, and we're both baseball fans. I'm a baseball fan. I love talking about baseball. Chicago Cubs fan, for those of you in the audience from the Midwest. First place Chicago Cubs. Can't say that very often, but I can say that today. First place Chicago Cubs. Let's talk about batting averages, right? So if you have a batting average in Major League Baseball, top batting average last year was Bobby Witt Jr. He was the batting champion from the Kansas City Royals. But he was 100 points better than the average batting average major league hitter last year, 100 points. So that's a historically large spread. If you didn't know that, right, and to understand the context of who's good, who's really succeeding, who's not, right, it can be really difficult to know if your campaign is good or if your campaign is great, and you're not necessarily getting the right aspects of that without some of that comparison. I encourage everyone to be using longitudinal data. So data sets like the IQVIA's LAD data set. We are able to see signals in that about physicians attempting to write a product and patients attempting to fill a product, even if they're not successful with it. Right? If you initiated a campaign and you're only measuring that batting average against successful fills or patients actually getting on treatment, you could be missing 80 or 90% of the action in that baseball game, right? It's really important for us to think about that.
It's a great answer, Luke, and great analogy with baseball and batting average in context overall. The way we're going to structure some of the questions today as we get into it a little more deeply here is in 3 phases. We, in the attempt to make this as practical and actionable as possible, we're going to ask some questions now through the lens of crawl, walk, run approach. And just kind of building on what Luke was just talking about, Jason, when getting started, how can teams build systems focused on delivering specific actionable KPIs? And maybe, with your response, if you could share a specific example, that would be great.
Sure. And I think like the pick right up on the baseball analogy, that often when we're coming into engagement, omnichannel from a MarTech perspective right now is a complicated ecosystem. There's all the audience understanding and the segmentation that Luke was just talking about that you're doing up front, but then you're dealing with a variety of different digital and non-digital systems where you're trying to combine data together to really assess performance. So I think that when pragmatically from a crawl standpoint, that just making contact with the ball, what's going to get you from the batter's box to first base? What is the most valuable data connections that you can make to understand that HCP journey? I think when we think about omnichannel, because it's right there in the name, omni, you think about everything, but pragmatically, you have to start with connecting the most valuable data sources together and doing it in a way that you're going to build those longitudinal learnings, because we certainly wouldn't want to compare a mature market versus an immature market, whether it's payer access or the number of patients or some of the things that Luke was alluding to. So some of the things that my team tries to do when we come in and look at it, just from a metadata perspective, what's the information that we're capturing? How can we turn those into short-term signals as well as long-term signals, and making sure that if there is valuable data sets in different platforms, what are we doing to connect those together? Not getting lost in the weeds of so many different systems, but really starting with the priority. What's going to connect to the business outcomes the best? So that way we're not losing sight of all the touch points along the way for the HCP.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, and maybe I could see a question from the audience at just a common understanding of what omnichannel is and how it varies from multi-channel. So maybe I'll take a pause here to just align on how we think about omnichannel, and that is really the difference between an omnichannel approach and a multi-channel approach is creating that personalization at scale, being able to have those one-to-one communications in the most relevant way. With the right content and the right context for those communications. That's really what makes omnichannel different from multi-channel. Multi-channel, think of it as blasting messages out in an unprecise way, and omnichannel is really trying to create those one-to-one connections so that that conversation feels more relevant and meaningful to that target audience that you're trying to engage with. And in order to be able to do that effectively, you need to have your data organized. And the data is really what enables your ability to create those seamless one-to-one connections. And that's critical, but it can also feel overwhelming. So, with that in mind, how can teams avoid that kind of analysis paralysis while still letting the data guide their decisions? Luke, do you want to take a crack at that one?
It happens to all of us, happens to me as well, right? So amongst the many things that I talk about right now is all of the Trump administration policies and all of the news that's going on. That's overwhelming for everybody, even those of us who have been in the industry and do this stuff all the time. Omnichannel is no different, right? I take off your marketer hat and put on your consumer hat, right? And how do you consume information? Right? And if we overwhelmingly look at this in 2 big channels, push versus pull promotion, right? If you're pushing information to a provider, that's a rep going into the office, that you're doing a speaker program, that's email blast campaigns, right? It doesn't matter the channel. It's you pushing that information out. That is us as a consumer. If we're on the other end of that. That's how most people advertise to us, right? So think about that if you're going out and you're watching TV, and if you watch the same baseball stuff that I do, you see a lot of DraftKings, you see a lot of betting stuff. That's pushing that out to you to try to do that. What's the other side of that? Pull promotion, right? That's where your consumer is actually trying to bring information to them, right? As an omni-channel promotion strategy, you need to be able to delineate between these two. Because if you're pushing information, that's only half of this, because not all of us consume information via push. Many of us would rather pull information to us. You're going to go onto the website. You're going to do a Google search. You're going to be looking at trends. Let's say you're going to try to buy a car, right? Are you going to buy a car off of seeing an advertisement on TV? Probably not. You're going to spend some time on the internet researching this, looking at multiple dealers, right? Those are signals that exist that you are trying to pull information to you. A good omni-channel strategy at the very core of it balances push and pull. As you do that, and you think about that as a core strategy, now you have a good foundation so that if you're in that crawl phase and you're saying, okay, when am I going to push? What am I going to push? What's the mechanism, the mediums by which I'm pushing? When I am pulling or the consumer is pulling, where do I need to be so that I can have that information that they're pulling from be as favorable as the information that I can put out there to be, right? So the very core of it, push and pull.
Great. So Jason, as you think about the push and pull strategy and kind of operationalizing that, a lot of times these large omni-channel initiatives can take a while to implement, getting the MarTech stack in order, getting your data organized, all of those important steps in getting a high functioning system in place. There's oftentimes a desire to get quick wins along the way. Can you talk a little bit about how you balance sort of the vision for, that perfect, that ultimate omni-channel ecosystem and the need to get quick wins to kind of build momentum as you're working toward that North Star?
Yeah, great question. And I'll tackle it like in two different parts, because I think that part of our job in terms of collecting the data and curating the data is we need to perpetually be building for the future, just because, like as Luke mentioned earlier, the longitudinal information is such a competitive advantage of understanding how you can roll things out. So we're looking at the data curation or the data collection portion of omnichannel with really what can help us service us today, but building for the future as well, because it doesn't really cost too much more to collect data or have a good metadata strategy, especially with AI and the other things that are coming out there. So having that core data foundation is critical in terms of especially some of those push messages that you're putting out there in terms of how you're collecting that. In terms of the second part of your question about how do you get those quick wins, a lot of it is done in the off season, to follow the sports analogy a little bit. You need a plan to have those wins early on. And it's as pragmatic as testing and learning and understanding how do you get a read and understanding how can we get statistical significance in figuring out whether it's just a creative test or an audience test or a promotional test. You really need to do that prior to launching the campaign if you want those quick wins, because we tend to look at it here on my team as inductive and deductive analysis. And I think that if you're trying to stare at all the data after the campaign or whatever the promotion has been for a month, and you're trying to be Sherlock Holmes and just say, all right, what is this telling me? What's working, what's not working? You're going to get analysis paralysis of what's going in there. Whereas if you seed it early on based on the segmentation or the market dynamics, then you're pragmatically going to be able to say, hey, after a month, we want to optimize and find the efficiency, whether it's a creative, the day part of when you're sending the message, the email subject line, really seeing it all in there. So that way, once you build that testing and iterative culture, it's easier to go through it. But I think what happens is that there's so much effort in these omnichannel engagements that you're so excited to get it out there that's when the real work begins in terms of having testing and adherence to understanding what's going on. So it's easier to see that in the beginning and having a good measurement strategy to dictate that before you get going.
That's great. Thanks, Jason. You can see we've got the infinity loop up on the screen now, which is really this idea of how we think about creating these omnichannel ecosystems that get smarter over time. You can see on the left-hand side of the loop, you've got the storytelling piece. That's that personalization at scale we were just alluding to. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the technology, all the technology platforms that are going to allow you to pass that data through the system that you've created so that you can enable those one-to-one connections. And all of this needs to be aligned to the customer journey that you've figured out before enacting any of this. So we always start practically with the deep understanding of your target audience's journey. How are they going through their process of learning about your therapy? whether it's an HCP or a patient or a caregiver. What is that journey? Where are they getting hung up? Where are they needing more information to advance? And then how can you make that content as relevant to them in that journey as possible? And so, Luke, when you're thinking about crawling in a real world context, how do you start collecting meaningful data to begin that testing that Jason was just alluding to?
Yeah, I'm going to go stay with our baseball analogy here for a minute. We're data guys, right? Jason and I'm a data nerd. I love to dig in, love statistics. It's one of the reasons why I love baseball. But not everybody's Billy Bean, right? So the ability to play Moneyball and look at your infinity loop and say, which one of these do I need to tune up and tune down? That may be more sophisticated than you may be at, depending on where your organization is, the level of support you have, the partners you have, the data you're using. So the desire to do that, now, for those of us that are analysts and like numbers, man, we love to dig into this stuff. And sometimes I enjoy having that analysis by paralysis because I'm getting in deep into the weeds and trying to figure stuff out. I'm sure there's people in the audience like that too. But I also like to storytell. You can probably tell that. So, the left-hand side of this is probably where I find myself a little bit more naturally. Well, if you are just starting out, start with your story, right? So what is the story that I'm going to tell? And think about that, okay, how am I going to tell that story to different physician types or different stakeholders across the ecosystem? Is it the same story or do I need to tweak it? Right? And can I tweak that based off of, the type of patient that they have in their office, the demographics of those, of the community that they may be in, the preferred channels that you can see through how they consume information. Physician to age is yet another one that you could potentially tweak on. So this concept of where you go, spend the time understanding your story first. And whatever that value differentiation is, those are some of the segments that you need to begin to build out so that you can tell that differentiated story across this piece. And then all of these other pieces begin to fill in over time. But if you try to play Moneyball right out of the gate, that's going to be tough.
Excellent. So, one of the questions that just came in from the audience is, can we share thoughts about maybe favorable channels for each phase if you're in that sort of crawl phase, trying to, build those quick wins? I know, for example, we like to leverage things like IQVIA data and use that in conjunction with our, targeted media strategy to get those quick wins. Jason, can you talk a little bit about, maybe as companies are in the process of either standing up their MarTech stack or, we're in there trying to optimize the MarTech stack, making sure the API feeds are flowing the way they're supposed to. And so while that work is happening on the back end, what can be done on the front end to increase your performance and overall conversion rate?
Yeah, and I think that when we think about the spectrum of channels, all the way from paid search to display to endemic to CRM, there are a lot of ways that we get messages out there. So I think that, almost the same way that we do propensity scoring for our audiences, so what do you have right now that is ready to go, that's built, that's approved? Where I get a little bit greedy as a data guy is, what can we test? What can we learn? Because sometimes the rush of getting things live can get over it. But what Luke was just saying, start with the story. That's what we do with the data as well, because basically mapping the metrics to where the audience is in their journey. And then it's as simple as testing. Do we think that HCPs, when they're coming to paid search, they're much closer to prescribing, or is that their initial introduction to understanding about a new treatment option? So the answer to the question from a crawl, walk, run standpoint is there's not a perfect answer, but I think certainly in terms of whether it's the push of being in market, because obviously no one's brave enough to do the full A/B test of let's not market at all and see what happens and do that really dramatic control. So I think it's starting with what you have and then aligning it to what you can connect to. And that goes back to the taxonomy and making sure that you're passing good metadata from no matter what channel, whether it's CRM, paid search or display into the other systems, so you're learning about the audience. And like that helps solve the complexity, so that way you can get smarter over time.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. So now, go ahead, Luke.
No, I'd just add a piece on that, because I agree with what Jason's saying. It's that, when you're walking, it's really about kind of that audience formation, and how are you trying to understand where the larger segments are. So if you imagine that this big Venn diagram, where are the biggest overlapping areas? That's a really good start. When you're walking, right? So if that's crawling and you're walking, it is about creating the extrapolation of where those overlapping segments are, so that you can do things like digital twinning, right? So you can say, hey, I have this behavior that I identified within my market research. What's the dynamic of that segment? How big is that segment, right? So, and it's that expansion question of being able to say, okay, how can I take information that I have over a smaller population and put that over a big population, right? That's a really good example of where you're walking on this. And where you're running is when you've got the infinity loop actually working and all of this pieces, and it's truly seamless on this. That takes a while, right? It takes investment, it takes good partners in order to be able to do that, it takes good data to be able to do that, and strategy to go from that walk to that run, because it's a really easy spot to stumble on, for sure.
For sure. Well, let's stay in the walk phase right now and think about, like, okay, we're in this process now. We've started to get our quick wins. We've got the organization aligned that omnichannel is something we want to do, and we want to start to really, get that MarTech stack working the way it needs to. Jason, once a team has collected some solid data, how do we increase the sophistication in how we're using that data?
Yeah, and really, it goes back to having the metadata encoded. I think I once heard a quote that, like, change and iteration is what the magic of AI is. So I think that as we think about leveraging this data, whether it's just simple regression analysis or like going into AI, you have to have the appetite to make changes and make decisions on the information that you have. So where we try to start is, again, going back to the segmentation, is understanding what information we're collecting, and then what are the levers that we can pull based on that metadata as we begin to see some things work better than others, in terms of like the content creation. So the pragmatic way about it is that understanding, where are we seeing higher engagement, or if you think about it in terms of lead scoring, just even if it's simple digital engagement on the website, are we getting enough lead scoring to inform when we want to send a follow-up message? Or is there a gap there that we need to figure out a data solution to close that loop a little bit more? So I think from the actionable standpoint, what we like to do here is think about it almost as an algorithm, in that if we get this information, this read, have the plays almost ready to go. So that way you're not burning time from a momentum standpoint. It's like, all right, if this creative's working better or this channel's working better than anticipated, what's that next play that we want to follow up with, almost pre-scripting it a little bit, so that way we're not losing a lot of time in the ideation time. That's not to say that sometimes things are surprising, but then that requires a little bit more analysis. But what we try to do is think one step ahead, or begin with the end in mind about what is the corresponding action that we may want to take based on the results.
Awesome. And Luke, from either your experience or experience that you've seen with other organizations, what key lessons would you share about sort of some of the insights you've gained in this walk phase?
Yeah, think about it where you may be aligning to the life cycle of a product, right? So if you are still in the walk phase when a product is mid-life cycle, right, you probably need to think about accelerating that. If you're still in the walk phase when a product is in the early part of its life cycle, that's probably okay, right? Because you're trying to learn about how product uptake is happening. Maybe those first few years on the market, you need the closed loop information to understand, so that you can begin to dial this in as you begin to see adoption occur, and who that adoption is occurring with, both at the physician level and the patient level. I would add to that understanding systems on this as well, right? So how does a health system or a community or a geography influence that? And are there attributes about that general dynamic that as you now look across geographies that you can, or across entities, that you can begin to understand some pieces about? If you're doing that in your mid-life cycle, you're probably not moving fast enough, right? Because you don't have necessarily enough time left in the life cycle in order to truly accelerate the value of the brand as it's being in the market, right? So put that, in your hat. So one of the reasons why it's so important to do this investment early and to have good launch planning as you're coming into the market. I mean, a lot of the stuff that Jason just talked about, you can be doing these years in front of launch, right? You can segment before your product's into the market and understand the flow of those segments through research and data, so that once you do get into the market, you can accelerate that from the crawl to the walk phase as fast as you can.
The one thing I'll just add to that is that certainly, like, we're speaking primarily about launch, but also market changes, loss of exclusivity, like understanding, what are you going to do if you're shifting to an NPP, system, understanding, making sure that you have those things in place, that as you begin to put a new lens or a new flavor of segmentation on your audience, that you have things ready to go for when that change occurs.
Excellent. All right, so we're in the walk phase now. We've done our segmentation. We've used that analysis to help us deliver more precise messages to those target audiences. We've tagged up our owned properties, our websites, unbranded, branded. So we're collecting all the information we can as people start to engage with that content, and we're effectively passing those signals onto the back end stack so that we can be more precise in how we're delivering our CRM engagement, whether it's email or what have you, both from a sequencing of messaging perspective and making sure the messages that are being delivered are aligned to the segments that we've figured out up front. So we're kind of in that, I'd say, mature phase of omnichannel, but we're not at that high performing phase quite yet. So as we move into the run phase, Luke, can you tell us a little bit about how teams can move faster from an execution perspective without sacrificing quality or compliance, especially in a highly regulated space like pharma?
Yeah, anytime we'll answer the compliance piece first, right? So spent a long time as reps, spent a long time in the marketing chair. Compliance folks are our friends, right? And even if that can sometimes be a contentious relationship, I've been through many med legal reviews over my years and had some pretty crazy conversations along the way. We want to stay compliant. They're there to help us, right? So keep us on the straight and narrow, and to make sure that we're not going to put ourselves or reps put themselves in jeopardy. Second piece, though, about how do we accelerate, and not quite necessarily to the run phase yet, but to speed it up. Maybe you're doing like some of the speed walking that they do in the Olympics or something like that, right? So not quite running, but you're accelerating. This is where having the technology piece on this, I think, becomes really critical. Because if you can shorten the time between when an activity is happening and when you're measuring that activity and putting that measurement then into action, right? Technology on this has a huge ability to shorten that time. If you've created the signals correctly, right? And this part of going from crawl to walk is to fix the signals that were maybe incorrect. And that happens to the best of us. That becomes the piece that you rely on as you accelerate. And is that working, right? So are you measuring this correctly? Are you getting the signals out of this that you think you should be getting? And then measuring that so that you can continue on that acceleration curve.
That's great. Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point with collaboration with med legal and regulatory, and I think it kind of touches on what Jason said earlier as well, which is, begin with the end in mind, right? So when you're figuring out what KPIs are going to be important and what you're going to measure, you're kind of beginning with the end in mind. You reverse engineer sort of the system to deliver the outputs that are going to allow you to track whether you're being successful or not. With that in mind, beginning with the end in mind is also important when you're thinking about collaboration with your colleagues in order to bring the different functional silos to the table so that you can deliver in a more systematic approach for these target audiences. And so one of the questions we got from the audience here is, what have you seen to be the most effective way to encourage collaboration across teams and functions when everyone has their own priorities? Luke, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Yeah. So I'm going to tell another story here. That's right. I'm going to tell the story of collaboration through music. I want you to think about your favorite band. Pat, who's your favorite band of all time?
Oh, all time?
We didn't ask this question. Favorite band of all
time? Probably Tribe Called Quest.
Say it again. I didn't hear it.
Tribe Called Quest. Yeah.
They broke up. Right? Jason, what was your favorite band of all time?
The one that comes to mind that I've seen the most is Weezer.
Weezer. I don't know if Weezer broke up, right? Probably. Most bands break up. They make awesome music, right? But collaboration is really difficult. You get egos get in the way. You get questions of credit get in the way. You get questions of I am right, you are wrong getting in the way. There's way, 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 way more bands in the history of music that have broke up than have stayed together. There's not very many Rolling Stones or Red Hot Chili Peppers or The Who that play an entire career together. That just doesn't happen, right? So when we think about collaboration for us in the workforce, right, and in our industry, it is super matrixed. And just because something may be a priority for us does not mean that somebody else shares that same priority. Doesn't mean they don't think it's important, right? So getting on the right cycle of information as you're sharing that back and forth and putting together steering committees that allow you to, over time, align those cycles and to have debate in a healthy fashion, right, around some of these different assumptions and different directions, right? That's how you build collaboration. But to expect it to happen the first time you pick up an instrument, it doesn't happen very often. So, yeah, storytelling.
100%. The other thing I think of in regard to this is journeys in general are so important. We often think about journeys and engaging those target audiences along the journey, but this is also a journey inside your organization. Taking an omnichannel approach is a journey, and you don't want to bring folks along the journey at the end of the journey. You want them, if they're going to be bought in and really aligned to this ultimate strategy, you need them joining you on the journey from the beginning. And so the earlier you can engage those different stakeholder groups and create things like Luke said with steering committees so that there's a regular cadence of cross-functional collaboration so that you stay close together as you're moving through that journey, that's really critical to success over the long term. So Jason, another question, how do you evaluate which plays to run or rerun and maybe which ones need refinement or redesign once you're in this run phase and you're having some early successes, but you're also starting getting more signals and data back telling you maybe some plays might not be running as effectively as you originally had hypothesized?
Yeah, great question. I think it dovetails nicely into the question that you just asked about how you bring people together, because when you're running, there's a lot of information and speed coming at you, very fast. And I think that it's paramount for all the groups to be able to consume the same information and to have trust in that information. That's certainly why we put a big prioritization dashboards and kind of automating what's the information that we need to be looking at quickly. And then the answer, the second part of that question, what you just asked, is that when we're prioritizing all these things and getting the trust, again, having that data democratization and understanding that, having that framework that we're going to react this way, if we see a KPI act above this or below this, and having that algorithmic thinking to how we're going to react to the data. Because I think that, that's why benchmarks and other things like that are so critical. So you know how to react to the data, because that's one of the things that can kind of sidetrack a steering committee or any group that is understanding it because, oh, I've seen this number previously or elsewhere. What do we want to define it for this engagement, this audience, this specialty, whoever they are? Like, as we said earlier, segmentation in the geographic plays is a critical lens in which we're going to evaluate all this data. So when you're viewing any data or any signals, you don't want to get tripped up on it. So again, mitigating and calling out those speed bumps of how we're going to react when we see some of the data in advance is the first part of it. And the second part is just continuous refinement of understanding the data. So that way we're not losing trust as we go forward, because that can kind of backtrack you significantly if you're running a test or you're not letting things get to statistical significance. Then it's like, well, we didn't really learn what we wanted to learn. So now you're kind of still at like, the beginning of the run phase, as opposed to having a parking lot of optimization and test plans that you want to put into market.
And then Jason, just kind of building on a little bit, when you're in this run phase, we're thinking about how the system's getting smarter over time. What does that look like in practice? Can you share an example of how you've seen, a well-oiled omni-channel system running, and how the data and insights that you're garnering from that system are helping you make better decisions on a go-forward basis?
Yeah, so the nerdy answer, and going back to baseball, is like, how are we measuring it and how we can take all those pieces to go forward. So like the pragmatic answer is that with all the metadata, and if we have the MarTech systems tied together in a right way, let's use HCPs as an example. If we're getting the PLD data from the media partners, we have the AIM XR pixel on the website, so we know the moment the doctor is coming to the website, reminding the AIM ecosystem data, understanding if they're researching a related content, and then we're tying that together with the CRM and the field force data. It's beautiful because we have aligned signals of the audience, and then we have the metadata, so we know what creative, what touches that they had, and then we can go as far as like running a next best action, be like, hey, Luke consumed this, this, and this. This is the right message that we want to send to him next. It's like, I view a lot of the role of marketing is like, how do we help make everyone else's job easier? And sometimes that's reducing the touches, or sometimes it's introducing them to that next concept to take the desired action. Going back to storytelling, where is it that we want them to go? And what is it that we think is going to help them get there? And that's exactly what we want to do from a data analysis standpoint, and then automate that. So that way we're not thinking about every time what message we want to send. It's like, you know what? This doctor's on the West Coast. Let's make sure we have the rules so we're not sending it at 6 a.m. Eastern, which is 3 in the morning their time, but we're kind of day parting it for the optimal time to open it with the right message for them.
Excellent, excellent. So Luke, shifting back to this run phase, and we got this well-oiled machine. If you could pinpoint one or two critical success factors for thriving in this phase of the journey, what would you focus on? What would you say they are?
The first one, synchronization, right? So, making sure that, going back to this question on collaboration, that you've got the system and the data infrastructure that's going to be synchronized with multiple stakeholders on the decisions that they need to make, right? Is it marketing? Is it market access? Is it finance, which is a really important decision maker in this? Is it field sales, right? And are you getting on this information cycle that's at the right time for those stakeholders to make the decisions and being aligned with the priorities of whatever it is for that brand? That's the first piece. That requires a well-oiled machine in order to do it. I've seen many organizations struggle. They have good brands and good campaigns and good people, but are not on the same page, right? So finding and spending the time to do that is really critical. In our baseball world, there's a lot of teams that have superstars and all-star talent that have losing records, right? Because they didn't come together as a team. There's also teams who don't have the same level of talent, but are on the same page and play well together, and they exceed expectations. That's part of what happens as you move into that run phase. If you can get people collaborating, that's an important part. Second piece on this is thinking about the level of effort that's required to scale, right? So analytics is a really good example of this. analytics for a long time in our industry has been brute force, right? It's you have spent all this time putting together sources of data, putting them into data lakes, right? Those data lakes really turn into data swamps. Stuff goes in there, kind of really hard to get out. And that's reality, right? And then you have managed services, oftentimes 500 people sitting in India, if you're a large pharma organization, that are doing the managed services on top of those analytics. That's slow, right? That makes it really hard to scale that, to be reflective of like market dynamics in the real time as they're happening. So to Jason's comments a few minutes ago about automating this and getting a single source of truth that people can agree to, that this is what we're measuring, this is why we're measuring it, this is the expected outcome. If I'm deviating from that above or below, I'm expecting action to happen, right? That conversation on alignment and scale, right? Those are two pieces that are really critical as you think about being in this run phase, because it's very easy, either one of those out of sync, and you're going to trip up.
So true. So true. All right. So we've got a couple more questions from the audience here. One is from someone who's still in the crawl phase, and they want to know some KPIs that have proven to be effective and successful when implementing an omnichannel approach and being in that crawl phase. So Jason, can you maybe share a couple of KPIs that you have seen to be important in that early phase of the game?
Yeah, and I think before I jump to KPIs, I'll just go to defining the data, because I think often what we see people in the crawl phase, they're talking about impressions or sends, and they're not anchoring it to the individual. And then even at the individual level, are you talking about HCPs or visitors on the websites or sessions? So I think just having a good organization of to what grain the data is that that will at least, like, even if it's not connected, you're evaluating a CTR. Is it for unique opens or every open, in terms of like how you're evaluating? So that's the first part. I think the other thing from a KPI standpoint is, again, understanding what your business's objectives are. So like if you're a big national drug, you're going to have a bit more data where you can evaluate CTRs like a little bit more quickly. Whereas if you're a smaller or like a more of a rare disease drug, then maybe you need to, base your CTRs on total like users or HCPs coming to the website over a period of time and anchoring it and not getting caught up in what I call sometimes the sugar high of a lot of data means that it's good, but really anchoring it in reality in terms of like, are you using a KPI that you can make a decision off of? Because I'm not going to make a decision off of 3 people opening an email, but 30,000 people opening email. You can make a decision there.
That'd be a pretty good campaign. 30,000 people. One of the pieces, I'm going to give you a market access answer on this, and we call it utilization management. So essentially, it's your batting average of a brand. If you look at launches, all launches going back to 2015, the average utilization management or success ratio of a patient, new to brand patient, being able to get on a brand in those first 12 months was about 50%. So about 1 out of 2 patients were successfully in launch brands in that first year, a decade ago, able to get onto the product. In 2023, that dropped by half. It was only about 1 out of 4, so about 25%. Put that into context, right? So in 2015, if you needed to get 500 patients onto a brand in order to hit your forecast, you had to generate demand of 1,000. If you're going by market averages, and we see many brands that kind of float to this market average, in 2023, it wasn't 1,000 patients that you needed to generate in order to get to 500. It was 2,000. Quite literally would have had to have doubled your demand in order to realize the same level of patient activity, of patients actually getting onto the product just 8 years later, right? That's an example of a really, really critical KPI that you need to understand about your product, because being able to define that correctly changes what you're diagnosing and what your strategy is. You could, again, have a very effective demand generation strategy, but lose that demand for whatever reason, access, lots of one and done, maybe there are side effect issues, maybe you should change your patient services program, maybe there's questions in regards to system access or payer access that you haven't addressed yet. That's very different from having a very successful marketing message that is driving activity and, being able to accelerate that versus pivoting and addressing critical issues that may exist elsewhere. So just one very real example, and one that we see many manufacturers, large and small, struggle with.
Excellent. So we got another question from the audience, and it's really around, they've got a launch that's about 2 years out. And, what should they be thinking about now if they're in that kind of crawl phase still? How should they be thinking about being ready as possible at launch? I'll start with some initial thoughts, and then I'll let you guys fill in the blanks. But I think when you're in this phase and you're 2 years away from launch, I always go back to starting with that segmentation, really having clarity around who it is you're targeting, who you're going after, and why your therapy matters most to them, and how to position the messaging and sequencing of that messaging to that target audience. So being very clear about that starting now is critically important. That can then start to drive where you take all of your storytelling and how you engage with those audiences once your system is in place. So if it's a market development situation, you're going to do an unbranded to branded handoff from both a patient and an HCP perspective. How are you starting to condition that market so that folks are ready when the drug is actually approved to be thinking about why this is a better fit than what's currently available, or why I should be thinking about this when I see a patient with XYZ diagnosis. So I think that's another important piece to be considering in that early phase, because the effectiveness you do in that market development pre-launch prep can really change the slope of the curve of your launch. It's so critical. If you do a really good job in that, laying that foundation, your uptake is going to be a lot greater, because you'll have pulled those patients and HCPs and caregivers into your database, into your ecosystem, and then you can enact different messaging strategies toward them based on the segments that you've identified up front. Another piece to think about in that phase is, what's your commercial mix going to be from a touch point perspective? How big is your field sales organization going to be? How much are you going to be wanting to leverage non-personal promotion, either in between face-to-face connections, or in conjunction with, or in those white space territories where you might not have field sales coverage? So really thinking deeply about how that mix is going to be structured, and then using that to determine where to best spend your energy in setting up the system for success. With that in mind, any final thoughts on that, upfront 2 years prior to launch, things that, are important to be thinking about? Luke, do you want to take a crack at it?
Yeah, Pat, I agree with all of the pieces that you said around the marketing segmentation. The other piece I would say that is very important at the T-2 years is the temporary product profile. And what do you think your label is going to look like, and testing the range of options, right? If you've only narrowed in on what you think your label is going to be versus what your label could be, you need to expand the question set a little bit, because there may be elements that you're able to achieve or not able to achieve that dramatically alter as you're coming closer and closer to the market. I was on a brand where we did not get the label that we thought we were going to get. We had a much narrower mechanism of action, and that affected the message that we were able to take into the market. We were down 4 or 5 in the priority list of where we ended up actually promoting from because of that question. So if we hadn't tested that, and we had gone in with what the assumed label was, that would have put us in a position where we were now trying to respond to a market and we weren't ready for it. The second piece, and kind of related to this one, is do not plan for a single launch scenario. Plan for multiple launch scenarios. What's a best case scenario? right? What if everything breaks your way and you are exceeding your forecast? How does that change your investment? Conversely, what if you are not doing as well as what you want? What's the worst case scenario, and what's the range between those? Because that changes what your promotional mix should be and what your spend commitments from an organization may look like, right? So thinking about that scenario and thinking about the range of your product profile, those have to be done at T-2 years. If you haven't done those by that time, you're behind and need to invest quickly in order to be able to do that.
Great point. Great point. So I see we're coming up on the end of the program here. So I just wanted to kind of wrap us up with a few key takeaways from everything that Luke and Jason shared with us today. First and foremost, start small with a use case that matters. Identify the one brand, the one segment, or the moment in the journey to test and learn. Don't wait for the perfect infrastructure. You're constantly going to be iterating. Know that up front, and just control the variables so that you can have clarity in what you're learning. Too many variables in play makes it more difficult to separate that signal from the noise. Second one, align KPIs to your business outcomes. Omnichannel isn't about more channels, it's about better outcomes. So define what success looks like before launching. So make sure you've got that internal alignment of how we're going to measure success, that cross-functional alignment on how we're going to measure success. And then you can develop your system to really deliver the metrics that'll let you know whether you're being successful or not. Thirdly, let the data lead you, not paralyze you. Even imperfect data can guide message sequencing and timing. Use what you have and then evolve that over time. And then build that agile measurement loop. Momentum comes from learning fast. So make sure you're measuring the right thing and then set up those feedback loops to make sure that you're seeing what's working and have the ability to optimize quickly. And then finally, don't go it alone. Find the right partners, folks who've done it before, whether it's tech partners, data scientists, customer experience teams. Omnichannel success depends on collaboration and not siloed execution. So as we wrap up here, any final thoughts, Jason, on what we covered today?
I think the key takeaways are the main thing. I think the one thing that we didn't touch on that does tie into MarTech is the privacy and consent landscape is also a big factor in obviously having the right partner that will help be your teammate to make sure that you're not running afoul and you're collecting data in the appropriate ways.
Excellent. And Luke, any final thoughts as we wrap?
Yeah, this weekend's Memorial Day. Watch a baseball game or two. So, we can learn a lot. We can learn a lot about our industry by listening to music and watching baseball. So, seriously, appreciate the opportunity to speak to your audience today. Thanks. Hope you guys found it at least a little entertaining and useful for our audience.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
I will also want to thank the audience and also you panelists for the great insights. Just to inform you, Seva will pop out on your screen. It's just for Marcus Evans to know what would you like to know more. What other webinar would you like us to create for you? And what industry topics and suggestions would you like us to follow on? Thank you so much for your time and have a lovely day ahead. Thank you so much, everyone.